I understand that President Obama has summoned certain congressional leaders to the White House tomorrow to discuss spending, debt, and deficits and the debt limit that we now operate under. The President has summoned congressional leaders to the White House on at least 8 different occasions in recent weeks to discuss budget and debt issues, not including the private talks involving Vice President Biden. Yet, with only weeks to go before the debt limit deadline, we're told, August 2nd, secret discussions have failed to produce any grand bargain. So I think we should stop paying attention to these private talks from which no details emerge and no public discussion occurs. We are getting much too close to the point at which it will be too late to involve the public and allow Congress to fulfill its constitutional duty on spending and taxing. In remarks yesterday, the President said, quote, "To truly solve our debt problem, we need to take on spending in domestic programs, in defense programs, and in entitlement programs," close quote. Well, I agree. Yet the only plan he's put forward proposed increases in his spending for next year in the budget he submitted. Well, the inflation rate is projected to be 1.3%. It may be a little higher than that. Defense, he called for a 4.3% increase in spending for defense. Energy Department called for an 8.9% increase in Energy Department. That big bureaucracy that spends its time trying to make sure that we block, it seems, production of American energy, permatoriums and off-limits and objections to producing energy. It proposes for the State Department a 9.3% increase in spending, and the Education Department a 13% increase in spending. At a time this country is in incredibly difficult straits, we're having double-digit increases. This is what the budget calls for next year that we're supposed to be working on now and are not. He proposed a 62.4%. You know, we've got to have high-speed rail in walking distance of 80% of all Americans or something like that. But this idea that we're going to have a massive national interlocking system of billion-dollar, maybe $700 billion of high-speed rail is not realistic in the short term. But his budget calls for a 62% increase. We asked where the money was coming from. They said it's a tax. Well, what kind of tax? Well, it's not a gas tax. So I called it the not gas tax. What tax then do you propose, Mr. Secretary, before the Budget Committee? Well, we'll talk with Congress about that. We're not going to pass a big tax to increase this kind of spending. Give me a break. If we do, we ought to use some of that money to pay down the debt, not continue to surge spending in this fashion. For the President of the United States to say that we need to truly solve our deficit problem, we need to take on spending in domestic programs, in defense and programs, and entitlement programs. And this is what we get as a proposal to increase spending at double-digit rates, basically. We're in a deep hole. It's hard to balance this budget. I've proposed legislation that would say we ought to have 7 days to consider this historic piece of legislation that would raise the debt ceiling. We want to see how much change in spending the bill would mandate. In other words, if we're going to raise the debt ceiling, because we've limited how much debt America can accrue, Congress has, and to keep borrowing, and we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend. If we keep borrowing, we have to raise it. And so what we're saying is, and the American people, I think, are saying, okay, we don't like raising it, but if you raise it, you better show us that you've changed your ways, that you're not continuing this kind of reckless spending when we don't have the money. 40 cents, every bit of that increase is borrowed.